Continuing with our examination of some of these artistic tools in the tools palette or pane in Photoshop CS6 and most other versions of Photoshop, let's take a moment to examine the function of the pencil tool. So we've selected it from the drop-down menu, and we're going to create a new document now. 1024 by 124 is fine. Really, any resolution here would be fine because we're just going to use this to demonstrate certain concepts. Actually, let's go a little bit low res with this. I'm going to say 256 by 256, and maybe you could do the same. Now, because we're specifying our dimensions in pixels, the resolution is irrelevant. Resolution is for print. If you're designing for the monitor, so if it's web design, or you're designing graphics for a computer game or anything that's going to be viewed on screen, then and you're measuring therefore in pixel data, then resolution really becomes irrelevant. And that's enough for now, so let's click OK. And there is our blank document. Alt middle mouse, zoom in and out. Yeah, fine. So the last thing I'm going to do is just unlock this background layer. I always do that because it's good practice to remember to do that straight away, and then you can create a new transparent layer above it. So you see we have the solid white background and we have this empty top layer, and as we draw on it, the new content and the background are kept separate, which is just good practice. You could very easily get yourself into a very sticky situation if you didn't follow that precedent, that practice. So just do. You'll save yourself an awful lot of heartache if you do. E is the hotkey, of course, for the eraser. So just tapping E will bring up the eraser. You can rub out anything that you've created. Anyway, trying to understand the difference between the pencil and the brush. Well, it's very analogous to the difference between a pencil and a brush in the real world. The pencil is generally sharp, whereas the brush is given to more, well, we must have a very large brush at the moment. Let's bring that down. I'm using the two square brackets to the right of the P key on the keyboard as hotkeys for enlarging and making smaller the diameter of the brush. So enlarging and reducing the diameter of the brush. So we paint much more organic and much softer forms with the brush, whereas with the pencil it's sharper. Looking at the options panel just up here, let's see what's different. So with the brush you have your presets, and then you have the option of changing size and hardness, and again a number of these little presets here. You have your mode, which is a blend mode for the pixel data. We looked briefly at that before, not in detail yet. And we have the opacity setting from completely transparent to completely opaque. And here we have one, anyway, of our pressure settings: flow, airbrush, and then we have a pressure for size setting. If we go to the pencil tool, you can see we lose flow on the pencil tool. So there's no spill. Let me see. The pencil tool, in other words, is pretty much always hard because it's designed to be hard. It's a pencil. You can't really get it to behave like a brush because we have another tool for that very purpose, the brush tool. So the pencil tool is really designed for hard-edged design. So where would that really come in handy? Well, of course, it has all kinds of applications. If you're a graphic designer and you're designing something that needs to have that kind of scribbly look, with the pixels showing, hard edged, or if you're designing something that is school themed or you know, sort of age appropriate to a younger generation, then you have these tools at your facility to use as you wish, and the pencil tool is a very useful one for that. Another area where it really comes into its stride is pixel art. And pixel art is basically where you come in, I'm reducing down my diameter to 1 pixel here. It's where you come in and you paint each individual pixel. It's used very often these days in retro game design. It's a retro aesthetic. There's my little pixel art man. So if you want to do that kind of work, then the pencil tool is the way to do it. One tip is under preferences, and we'll go into general. You can see that we have this image interpolation option. By default, that's usually set to something like bicubic, one of these bicubic settings. I think bicubic automatic is the default. When you're working with pixel art, it's important that you change this to nearest neighbor. I'll demonstrate why that is. I'll leave it at bicubic automatic for a minute. So as we said, we kept our content separate from the background white layer. Now, say I want to rotate him. And this is pixel art, keep in mind. So I want to keep everything sharp. I hit my Control-T hotkey to bring up the transform tool. Great, and then I rotate him to where I want him to be, and I hit enter. Well, what's just after happening? Well, what's happened here is that when I rotated him, and if you scale him, it applies algorithms, bicubic, bilinear, whatever it might be, to try and interpolate the shape, because usually when we do things like that in Photoshop, we want to keep the curves as smooth as possible. So Photoshop, excuse me, Photoshop by default is sort of set up to do that. So when you're rotating things in photos and things like that, anything that's sort of organic and realistic, it keeps it as curvilinear and as soft as possible. But in this specific application, we actually don't want that to happen because it destroys our art. So how do you get around it? Well, just undone my action. And now what we have to do is go back to our preferences here, and under general, you can also hit Control-K on the keyboard, that's the hotkey. We need to switch to nearest neighbor, and nearest neighbor, as you can see, preserves hard edges, so that's perfect. That's what we want for our image interpolation. When we're working with pixel art, you may also want to come back here and switch it back to bicubic automatic when you're working with something else, some other application of Photoshop. Okay, what's happening here is that the nearest neighbor setting has not been automatically filled in the options pane. Logically that should have happened, but it didn't, so we'll just have to do it again that way. Just be aware of that. There's the general setting, which you do need to tweak for pixel art, but when you're using the transform tool, which is Control-T, you also have to come up here and switch it to nearest neighbor, and that's going to preserve your hard edges. And there we go. So we still have our hard edges, and if I scaled that up or down, moved it in any way, it would still keep those hard edges. So that's how we work with the pencil tool. That's the difference between the pencil tool and the brush tool. In our next lesson, we'll look at the color replacement tool. Thank you for watching.